According to a 2024 analysis by the Washington Post, 60% of low-income countries across the globe are currently under some form of United States financial sanction. Think about the scale of that for a moment. The United States imposes 3 times as many sanctions as any other country or international body on Earth. It is the most frequently used weapon in the modern American foreign policy arsenal, yet it involves no troops, no airstrikes, and no direct military confrontation. Instead, it relies entirely on the invisible connective tissue of the global financial system and the dominance of the US dollar. The question is, what exactly is an economic sanction? How does a bureaucrat sitting in a government building in Washington, D.C. manage to freeze the assets of an oligarch in Moscow or halt the shipment of oil out of Tehran? Today, we are going to unpack the architecture of American economic sanctions. We will look at how they function on a technical level, which nations are currently cut off from the American economy and why, and the growing debate over whether this immense financial power actually achieves its intended goals, or if it is inadvertently reshaping the world order in unpredictable ways. Part 1. Historical context. To understand how the United States became a financial superpower capable of blockading entire economies with the stroke of a pen, we have to look at the evolution of economic warfare. The concept of using economic pressure to achieve political goals is not new. In the early days of the American Republic, President Thomas Jefferson implemented the Embargo Act of 1807, attempting to punish Britain and France for interfering with American trade. It was a domestic disaster that hurt the U.S. economy more than its targets, but the underlying instinct was there, using commerce as a substitute for war. Fast forward to the 20th century, and the League of Nations tried to formalize economic sanctions as a way to maintain world peace after the First World War, though largely unsuccessfully. The modern architecture of American sanctions really began to take shape during the Cold War. The United States realized that it needed ways to contain Soviet influence and punish adversarial regimes without risking a nuclear exchange. The classic example here is Cuba. Following Fidel Castro's rise to power and the nationalization of American property, the U.S. implemented a trade embargo in the early 1960s. That embargo was designed to isolate the island nation and force a change in governance.
But the real explosion in the use of sanctions, what policy experts often refer to as the sanctions decade, began after the Cold War ended. The 1990s saw a surge in the application of economic penalties, but the true paradigm shift happened after the September 11th attacks. The U.S. government realized that tracking and blocking the flow of money was one of the most effective ways to dismantle terrorist networks. The Treasury Department was granted unprecedented powers to weaponize the global financial system. Since the year 2000, the use of economic sanctions by the U.S. has surged, increasing over 9-fold by 2021. Sanctions went from being a blunt instrument of total embargo to a highly calibrated, precision-guided financial weapon. They are now viewed by lawmakers as a tool of first resort for addressing a massive range of national security, foreign policy, and economic threats. Part 2. The technical breakdown. So, how do they actually work? The engine room of American sanctions is an agency within the Treasury Department called the Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC. OFAC with the entity responsible for administrating and enforcing economic and trade sanctions based on U.S. foreign policy and national security goals. There are essentially 3 main tiers of sanctions that OFAC manages. The first and most severe is the comprehensive sanction. A comprehensive sanction essentially builds a financial wall around an entire country or region. It broadly prohibits almost all transactions between U.S. persons and anyone living in that jurisdiction. No trade, no investment, no financial service.
The second tier involves sectoral sanctions. These do not target an entire nation, but rather specific, vital industries within a foreign economy. For example, the U.S. might target a country's energy sector or its financial institutions, making it illegal for Americans to provide funding or technology to those specific parts of the economy, while leaving other sectors untouched. This allows the U.S. to inflict economic pain on a government without completely devastating the civilian population's access to basic goods. The third tier is list-based sanctions, often referred to as targeted sanctions. OFAC maintains a massive database called the Specially Designated Nationals and Blocked Persons List, or the SDN list. If you are an individual, a company, or a terrorist organization placed on the SDN list, your U.S. assets are immediately frozen and it becomes a criminal offense for any American citizen or business to conduct transactions with you. But here is the real secret to the power of American sanctions: the U.S. dollar. Because the dollar is the world's primary reserve currency, almost all international trade from oil to agricultural goods is priced and settled in dollars. To settle a dollar transaction, the money usually has to route through a correspondent bank in the United States. This means that even if a French company is buying goods from an Indian company, if the transaction is in US dollars, it touches the American financial system. Because of this, the US government has jurisdictional reach over a massive percentage of global trade. Furthermore, the US enforces what are called secondary sanctions. Secondary sanctions threaten foreign, non-US persons and companies. The US essentially tells a foreign bank or corporation, you can do business with this sanctioned target, or you can do business with the United States, but you cannot do both. Given the size and importance of the American economy, almost every multinational corporation and international bank chooses to comply with OFAC rather than risk being locked out of the U.S. financial system. Part 3. The global map. Let us look at the global map today. Which countries are currently facing the full weight of comprehensive American sanctions, and what did they do to end up there? The most comprehensively sanctioned jurisdictions right now are Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Syria, Russia, and certain conflict regions of Ukraine, specifically Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk. Cuba has been under sanctions since the 1960s, originally in response to the nationalization of American property and subsequent human rights violations. It is one of the longest-running embargoes in modern history.
North Korea faces comprehensive sanctions due to its aggressive pursuit of a nuclear weapons program and repeated violations of international agreements. The goal here has been to starve the Kim regime of the hard currency and materials it needs to build ballistic missiles. Iran is heavily sanctioned for a combination of reasons. The U.S. has cited Iran's support for international terrorism, its own nuclear program ambitions, and human rights violations. These sanctions have profoundly crippled the Iranian economy, effectively cutting off its ability to openly sell oil on the global market and locking its central bank out of international financial networks. Syria is under strict, comprehensive sanctions as well. These were largely expanded in response to the brutal tactics used by the Assad regime against its own citizens during the Syrian civil war, with the aim of cutting off the government's ability to fund its military operation.
And then there is Russia, which represents a historic test of the sanctions tool. The U.S. first imposed sanctions on Russia in 2014 in response to its annexation of Crimea. But following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the United States, alongside the European Union and other allies, unleashed a barrage of sanctions that made Russia one of the most heavily sanctioned nations globally. This included massive sectoral sanctions targeting Russian energy and finance, freezing the foreign reserves of the Russian central bank, and placing hundreds of Russian oligarchs and government officials on the SDN list. For example, the U.S. sanctioned billionaire oligarch Oleg Deripaska, which caused immense disruption in the global aluminum market because his company, Rusal, was one of the world's largest producers. The goal was to degrade Russia's military-industrial base and limit its ability to fund the war in Ukraine. Part 4. Nuanced perspectives and controversies. This brings us to a critical debate. The United States has built the most sophisticated machinery for economic warfare in human history. But do these sanctions actually work?
The evidence is surprisingly mixed. The primary goal of economic sanctions is to coerce governments into changing their policy or behavior. However, extensive empirical research suggests that success is rare. A well-known study by the Peterson Institute for International Economics found that since 1970, unilateral U.S. sanctions have achieved their foreign policy goals in only 13% of the cases where they were imposed. In many cases, heavily sanctioned regimes, like those in Cuba, Venezuela, and Iran, have survived for decades.
Some political scientists argue that broad-based sanctions can actually help targeted governments shore up domestic support by giving them a convenient external enemy to blame for their economic failures. There is also a significant cost to the United States itself. While the benefits of sanctions are sometimes elusive, the economic costs are highly tangible. Research has suggested that economic sanctions cost the United States between $15 billion and $19 billion annually in potential exports. That lost trade translates into hundreds of thousands of lost jobs in the American export sector. Beyond the economic data, there are profound humanitarian concerns. Critics point out that comprehensive sanctions often inflict the most severe pain on ordinary civilians rather than the political elites they are meant to target. By degrading a country's economy, sanctions can lead to inflation, unemployment, and shortages of critical goods. During the COVID-19 pandemic, human rights advocates and international officials urged the United States to suspend certain sanctions to help alleviate the pandemic's impact on vulnerable populations in sanctioned countries.
Finally, there is a geopolitical risk. By using the US dollar and the American financial system as a weapon, the United States is incentivizing its rivals to find workarounds. Academic researchers have noted that sanctions against Russia have, in some ways, accelerated a process called de-dollarization. Countries that fear they might one day cross the United States are actively seeking to build alternative payment networks and are trading in local currencies to bypass OFAC's reach. Furthermore, these sanctions are pushing historical adversaries closer together, for instance, creating stronger economic and strategic ties between Russia and China. If the rest of the world successfully builds an alternative to the dollar-dominated financial system, the United States could lose the very leverage that makes its sanctions so powerful in the first place. Economic sanctions remain a cornerstone of American foreign policy. They offer a middle path between empty diplomatic protests and the devastating costs of armed conflict. But as the map of sanctioned nations grows, so too does the complexity of the global blowback. If this deep dive gives you a clearer picture of how global power actually operates behind the scenes, send the link to a friend who likes unpacking the big geopolitical shift.